Good. Well, I think you've looked long enough at the image on the screen. Let's move on to the meat of my talk this afternoon. And I want to start out by saying that it's threefold. Everybody hear me at the back? You all right at the back? Good. It's a wonderful sound system here. It's threefold, like the image that you see on the screen here. Part 1 situates Ockham Park in Surrey. Part 2 investigates the fascinating provenance of the Ockham Park album of architectural records related to the country house in question. And finally, in part 3, I end by analyzing the light that these records shed on the design process of the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor, which he engaged on with his clients Lord and Lady King. As with the dramatis personae in a play, sculpted portraits of 3 of my characters introduce the discussion. Angela Hornack kindly provided me with this rather dour likeness of the architect. There it is. And he also very kindly specially photographed for me the funeral monument in Ockham Parish Church of Peter King and his wife Anne, which Rupert Gunnis's Biographical Dictionary of British Sculptors attributes to John Michael Reisbrach. I'll more to say about Gunnis in part 2. Hawksmoor, born in 1661, needs little introduction, having emerged brilliantly over the past 60 years from behind the shadows of his great teacher, Sir Christopher Wren, and his flamboyant architect collaborator, Sir John Vanbrugh. Lord and Lady King, however, have retreated into obscurity to the same degree. Peter King, a Devon-born lawyer and cousin of John Locke the philosopher, abandoned his early career and study of theology for a distinguished legal career. Queen Anne knighted him in 1708, and his fortunes further blossomed under Anne's successor George I, for whom Sir Peter King began serving as Lord Chancellor in 1725, in consequence of which he was elevated to the title of Baron King of Ockham. He relinquished office in 1733 for reasons of health and died the next year, and his architect only survived him 2 years longer. But Baroness King outlived them both until 1767, and I suspect that Anne King may have been the one to compile the Ockham Park album. But where is Ockham Park in the first place? This 20th century redrawing of a portion of the 1706 Ockham estate map gives us a partial answer to that question. The estate consisted of numbered parcels of lush farmland slightly north and east of Guildford. At one edge of the property, as shown in the little vignette there, stood the original manor house of about 1620, all brick, the so-called Big House, built for Henry Weston, whose heirs sold it to pay off their debts in 1711, hence the production of the map. The purchaser, Sir Peter King, became the new lord of the manor. Off to the right or north of the vignette, you can see the attached service wing, later rebuilt by Hawksmoor in 1723 as a prelude to his radical conversion, or his intended radical conversion, of the Big House. Shortly after 1800, an otherwise unknown draftsman named A. Thacker drew Ockham's east or principal entrance facade. There it is. It's the earliest record I know subsequent to Hawksmoor's intervention, and the first in a remarkable long series of such images. Topographical draftsmen beat a path to Ockham in surprising numbers, considering how unattractive, I have to say, a house it turned out to be, as you'll see yourselves. The original brickwork of 1620, as you see, has been covered over. 3 of the gables that we saw a few moments ago got lopped off, and a 2-column portico occupied the center, and the end bays received 2-story tall, bow-windowed projections. Next in chronological sequence comes a pencil preparatory drawing by John Preston Neal, dated the 13th of July, 1826. The drawing belonged to Howard Colvin when he showed it to me in 1985. More about him shortly. At top center, Neal focused on the chunky Hawksmoor detailing at the top of the bow window, right there. One of the few things about the facade that hinted at the architect's artistic presence. 2 years later, in 1828, George Frederick Prosser came out with a rival publication to Neil's Seats of Noblemen. Prosser's view shows the even less prepossessing west or garden facade of the house, and I would have skipped it altogether had it not been for the fact that poking up over on the left-hand side there, you can just see the top of the cupola that sits above the service wing clock tower, Hawksmoor's most delightful addition to Ockham. Sadly, as the late 19th century photograph beside me here shows, the cupola vanished at some point during the alterations to the house in the 1830s by the 8th Baron King, created First Lord Lovelace. Now, many of you will have heard of him, better known as the husband of Lord Byron's mathematician daughter, Ada Lovelace, a kind of a new cult figure, I would say. The Earl was an amateur architect in his own right, and he embellished his nearby principal seat, East Horsley Towers, which, as its name implies, bristles with Harry Potterish towers. And I surmise, but this is just my surmising, that Lord Lovelace erected them to complement the Italianate campanile here of Ockham, 3 miles away. It, like Hawksmoor's, a clock tower, has since gone. From late Victorian, dare I say, Byronic heights, Ockham began its slow decline. On the death of the widow of the second Earl in 1941, the house passed to a collateral member of the family, Judith 16th Baroness Wentworth, who eventually put it on the market. During restoration, the big house, which stood to the left over by the trees here in my 1985 color slide, caught fire one October night in 1948 and burned. The blaze only spared the stable block, purportedly dated 1724 on its rainwater heads, and the service wing, or offices, as Hawksmoor invariably referred to them. So the big house is no more. At some point before the fire, however, the Ockham Park album was removed from the premises and luckily survived. Other such country house albums exist, but this one that I'm going to be telling you about today is unusual in its rich array of material. 2 autograph letters by the architect, an estimate of his proposed alterations to Ockham, and 27 related drawings. Taken all together, this is the largest body of Hawksmoor's graphic oeuvre outside his native land. Regarding the amazing odyssey that brought the Ockham Park album finally to rest at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, Canada, several key members of another cast of characters, partly seen here, attest to certain crucial facts. According to what the late Sir Howard Colvin told me in a letter written in his spidery hand, the album turned up with a bookseller in Tunbridge Wells, advertised at what Colvin said was, and I quote, the absolutely low price, even then, of £5, if I remember right, end quote. The letter continues, as Rupert Gunnis lived in Tunbridge Wells, he received the catalogue a little sooner than I did. Otherwise, I would have got the drawings first, end of quote. What a lovely picture that paints of Colvin and Gunnis, the great lexicographers of British architecture and sculpture, respectively, vying for possession of this album. No date or sale or a bookseller's name has come down to us, but John Harris, a friend of both Colvin, Gunnis, and later myself, in his delightful little book of 1998, No Voice from the Hall, fondly recollects Pratley's Tunbridge Wells shop as, quote, the source of many of Rupert's books. H.W. Pratley became a trustee of Gunnis's fortune after his death in 1965, which almost surely cements the connection between him and the album. In 1984, I learned from my late lamented colleague at Queen's, J. Douglas Stewart, more about the unusual circumstances of the album's acquisition. He had heard from Gunnis's own lips what has to be one of the most fascinating of collectors' good luck stories. Gunnis, so Stewart told me, was in the habit of having breakfast brought to him in bed. One day, the Morning Post included a Tunbridge Wells bookseller's catalogue. You can see where we're going with this. Gunnis's quick eye immediately caught the mention of the Ockham album, described and priced as though it were a printed publication rather than an original manuscript. Gunnis knew that no such book existed. And the Ockham connection rang a bell with him, of course, on account of the fact that he knew the Ricebrack monument at Ockham Church. He grabbed the bedside telephone, called up the bookseller, and began the conversation as any cunning collector would by inquiring about some trifling items. And then, as if in passing, he asked whether the Ockham album were still for sale, and if so, could it be added to the other things that he had asked to buy. Minutes later, the phone rang. The bookseller, having meanwhile realized his blunder, asked if Gunnis really did want to have the album after all, and Gunnis confirmed that he did, and obviously the bookseller stood by his word. By the early 1960s, on his doctor's advice, Rupert Gunnis escaped to Sicily for the winter, and Stewart, by then a graduate student at the Courtauld Institute, elected to help him on his travels. In order to finance the trip to Sicily, Stewart said, Gunnis decided to sell the Ockham Park album. At this point, the celebrated London rare book dealer Ben Weinreb became the purchaser, and the portrait of Ben and his wife Joan, right here, was taken on the same occasion as the portrait of John Harris, namely the 1988 opening ceremony of the new museum to house the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. Its architect and founder-director, Phyllis Lambert, is seen in the third of these pictures wearing her preferred outfit of overalls. By this time, Ben, John, and Phyllis were friends and had collaborated to make the CCA the remarkable architectural repository it is. A crucial document from Phyllis's meticulously archived papers takes the form of an old-fashioned blue aerogram. Some of you in the audience will remember them. And it's posted from London on the 25th of May, 1964. John Harris sent it from the RIBA Drawings Collection, which he headed, to the New York City address of the gallery owner, Regina Slatkin. Judging from the letter's friendly tone, John and his wife Eileen already knew Phyllis well, and John makes clear that he was advising Phyllis in the formation of her architectural drawings collection in close collaboration with Ben, who, John says, would soon expedite a shipment of drawings. Among them, he goes on to write to Regina, quote, "You will be quite stunned by the Hawksmoor volume," end quote. What actually arrived, it must be said, differed, it seems, quite considerably in appearance from what had been sold to Gunnis years before. The Ockham Park album that Phyllis Lambert acquired and called Tremendous, in a letter that she wrote back to John, consists of this volume, you see it here, richly bound in red leather, tooled and gilded borders, 26¼ inches high by 20 inches wide, and on the spine of the volume is this leather ticket with the words I think you can all make out stamped in gold on it, and the date 1728. Inside, large sheets of blue paper have artfully pasted upon them the documents and drawings that I've already mentioned. Here is the first of those pages of blue paper, with a Hawksmoor letter of 1724 to Peter King above, there, and below it, the cover of Hawksmoor's cost estimate for the alterations. In a warm, if typically deferential letter, the architect complains of being too ill from gout to receive Sir Peter and asks him to consult Thomas Hinton, Hawksmoor's long-standing assistant, regarding King's, quote, commands, these commands presumably related to Ockham. Here is evidence of another kind of process, one that links architects and their trusted assistants. The cover of the estimate is no thing of beauty, but includes some interesting and, I think, important clues. Someone in a hand other than Hawksmoor's flowery one, I suspect this may be Anne, Lady King, writing years later, has penned the instruction half bound to the bookbinder, and above, has spelled out the inscription to appear, stamped on the spine just as you saw it. All well and good, or so it seems. Now, the fact that the album is fully bound in leather and not half-bound could easily be a last-minute change of heart on the part of whoever had the foresight to preserve the Ockham material. Speaking of that, Gunness took the far-sighted step of having the entire album photographed by the National Monuments Record, on whose board he sat for years. And the black and white images that bear the accession date 1948 give a terminus antiquem for his purchase of the album. He had to have bought it by 1948 because the photographs were taken in that year. He furthermore allowed the architectural historian and celebrated poet, glass engraver Lawrence Whistler, who died in the year 2000, to publish the material in a short illustrated article in Country Life magazine on December the 29th, 1950. In another article 5 years later, Whistler briefly but significantly referred back to the Ockham Park album as, quote, bound up between boards. Now, the phrase bound up between boards connotes heavy cardboard covers, not the luxurious present volume. And on the screen, you see one of those 1948 black and white photographs. And if you look closely at it, especially the edges of it over here, you can immediately make out that the 31 sheets of handmade rag paper within the album originally overlapped one another. So overlapping one another there. Make that out. So something very definitely different from the way that, of course, the album is presented at the moment, with each piece of paper mounted on what noted Canadian conservator Mervyn Ruggles calls blue machine-made paper. He carefully examined the album at Queen's in 1979 in preparation for an exhibition that I was organizing there, and at that time, Ruggles carefully lifted up from its blue support the sheet of handmade Honig brand paper to photograph the verso I show you here, not normally seen. Maybe the first audience to have ever seen it, I don't know. Here we see several quick variant designs for door frames in the entrance hall, among the most spirited of Hawksmoor's drawings for Ockham. To suggest projection and recession, his pen races over the surface, making hatching marks in sepia ink, and his brush judiciously applies areas of grayish wash, a technique you'll observe elsewhere in the album. From these two images, I conclude that at some point after its 1948 acquisition by Gunness and its sale to Phyllis Lambert in 1964, the album underwent a Cinderella-like transformation. What had been a humble-looking affair that Gunness had bought for a song ended up looking quite presentable and therefore more saleable. As for the leather ticket on the spine, it may have been transferred from the spine of the original booklet bound in boards or attached to a reused period binding that constitutes the present covering. Without Ben's or Gunness's say-so on these matters, we may never know the full story. Ben, who died in 1999, never spoke of it to me. In the color slide version, which has been laid out flat, of course, to show the whole thing, on the left, you see the diagonal paving pattern that Hawksmoor intended for the front wall at Ockham. On both images, you will remark the drawing of a little hand with an extended index finger. Do you see it all? Where is it? There and there. An index. I call this the Hawksmoor hand, pointing in this direction. He's indicating us that we should turn over the page, so why don't we do so? Now in the color image, you can make out here, it's the one piece over there, you can make out the upper floor of Ockham, numbered 1 at the top right, and dated February the 7th, 1729. And at the bottom right appears, there it is, the ghostly apparition of the paving pattern I just showed you, seeping through from the other side of the paper, for the verso or recto, depending how you want to see it. Here, with dark grey poche, Hawksmoor outlines the 17th century manor house of the Westons, and in lighter colored outline he indicates his proposed extensions to the north and south, his twin column porticos, the fact that he's going to put a big saloon out on the west. And I might add that by 1729, in February, when this drawing was dated, it's quite late in the design process, and some of these grander additions were already wishful thinking on the architect's part. Now, as good fortune would have it, there is a neater, more easily read, and more informative version of the same ground plan surviving elsewhere, and it reveals some of the design process of the architect. And it resides in the archives of the Minute Library here in South London, along with 3 other preparatory drawings for Ockham. These, in all probability, came from the April 1740 auction of Hawksmoor's library and personal papers. Most of the drawings itemized in the 1740 sale catalog published by David Watkin have been dispersed or have entirely disappeared. For example, according to the auctioneer, lot 99 consisted of, quote, 22 drawings of Lord King's house. Maybe the sheets in the Minute Library were among them. Cary Dowds, in his indispensable Hawksmoor monograph, numbers them among the 600 Hawksmoor drawings known to him, including the ones at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Drawn upside down, this plan, see they're just reversed in position, this plan of the Minute Library shows how Hawksmoor hoped to bring Ockham more into line with 18th century norms by filling out the 1620s, H shape of the big house with these projections. You see, so what was H, everything that's dark is the H, and then he's filling it out to make it more of a rectangle, completely flush all the way around. At the same time, however, he took his cue from the existing bay windows on the old house by trying out various flat or round modifications. Round there, flat there, round there, flat there, and so on. He was fooling around with how to do that, and was inspired by the older house in that regard. In addition, the Minute drawing provides insight into Hawksmoor's sources of inspiration. A written explanation or key at the bottom left, there it is, ends with the phrase, and I quote, "vestibule in form of ye salle de 4 colonnes," end quote. This phrase obviously applies to the 4-column square stair hall that Hawksmoor intended to place over there, to the left of center, never did. And the French words, salle de 4 colonnes, come directly from Claude Perrault's translation of Vitruvius's De Architectura. Von Hart's recent book on Hawksmoor devotes a useful note to this Vitruvian connection, but Hart did not realize that under the same Canadian roof as the Ockham Park album, there also resides a copy of the 1684 or second edition of Perrault, inscribed with these words, "Nick Hawksmoor at Chris Wren's in Scotland Yard." In 1980, Phyllis Lambert bought the book, which had been auctioned as lot 111 in Hawksmoor's sale. And the inscription, I think, gives us some idea of the and perhaps a touching proof of the attachment of pupil to a master, in this case, Christopher Wren. As already seen in the album, now we turn to the album in part 3. As already seen in the album, Hawksmoor's connection with Ockham Park and the Kings stretched back as early as 1723, 1724, when he undertook some unspecified work, which was perhaps to do with the stable block or the service wing, or offices, as Hawksmoor called them. But as often happens in architectural projects, starting out modestly did not preclude acquiring and aspiring to more grandiose proposals. None more grandiose, I think, than this elevation drawing dated January 1727, showing the total transformation of the east and south facades. The brick big house of the Westons disappears from view entirely behind new stone facades, although actually the brick core remains inside and continue to do so. The 2-story high, 11-bay long eastern or principal facade of Ockham is shown as an orthogonal elevation, and over there the 7-bay long south facade in slightly faulty perspective. The central bays on each facade take the form of porticos in the enriched Corinthian order. Flanking groups of windows feature the fashionable Gibbs surrounds of chunky rustication. I'll come to them in a moment. On the left of the entrance would have been the great parlor. On the right, the common parlor. Slightly set back to either side were pairs of bays identified as a new pavilion. That on the right was to house the library. It says so right there. Except for the reduction of the porticos from 4 to 2 columned, the facades as shown here agree with the Ockham Park second floor plan, which was dated 2 years later and which saw just a few moments ago. This stage of the design process suggests and represents Ockham at its biggest, boldest, and perhaps dearest to the hearts of architect and clients. At the same time, in 1727, Hawksmoor moved on to design the west or garden facade, which I can't help thinking must have been his favorite. And I say this because of the design's greater coherence, tighter proportions, and above all, the very pleasing repetitive positioning of the three-part openings, known technically as serlianas, in honor of the Italian Sebastiano Serlio, who popularized their use in illustrated books he published in 16th century Venice. In fact, Hawksmoor acknowledges this derivation when he labels the central and bow window side serlianas, right down there, and I quote, Venetian or more Venetian, in other words, in the Venetian style. 2 slightly recessed bays at the ends of the facade are marked a new pavilion there and there, and each of their 2 stories has a pair of rectangular windows with the banded surrounds named after Hawksmoor's near contemporary James Gibbs, who popularized it. Some critics see that the serlianas and the Gibbs motifs as evidence of Hawksmoor's capitulation to incoming fashions, Neo-Palladian ones in particular, because Andrea Palladio's name is often, but somewhat wrongly, thought synonymous with the serliana. Palladio actually used the motif infrequently. Whether or not Hawksmoor can be called a Neo-Palladian, his masterful rhythmic repetition of the 3-part openings created in the process a pleasing overall composition centered on this impressive serliana in the middle with unusually large areas of glazing. He furthermore enriched the facade with subtle projections and recessions, skillfully hinted at by applications of gray wash to simulate shadows cast by the setting sun. Elsewhere in the album, a detailed elevation of one of the projecting window bays shows Hawksmoor's singular preoccupation with this serliana motif at Ockham. The somewhat indecisive wording of the inscription in his hand reads, "If ye window in ye great parlour be Venetian, this is ye manor." So he was a little unsure as to whether these serlianas were really going to fly or not, as we would say today. This particular 2-story high window arrangement with flat-headed openings on the lower level and round-headed 3-part serliana in the upper level accords with the 2 upper-story plans of 1729, specifying window projections that are flat, on plan, or bowed, both alternatives shown side by side, as we witnessed a little while ago. Obviously, Hawksmoor and his clients had entered into this fruitful process of weighing the pros and cons of the shapes that the projections should take, flat versus curved. In a roundabout way, forgive the pun, the drawing raises the possible significance of these particular windows to Peter King, their Neo-Palladian stylishness quite apart. The late Giles Worsley has discussed the significance of the serliana in general and also with respect to Hawksmoor's churches, notably Christ Church, Spitalfields. There, this triune type of opening clearly brings to mind Trinitarian meaning, the 3-personed God of the poet and cleric John Donne. "Batter my heart, 3-personed God," writes Donne. In this connection, I return to the career of Peter King. Before entering the legal profession, he had written and published anonymously in 1791 an inquiry into the constitution, discipline, unity, and worship of the primitive church that flourished within the first 300 years after Christ. It's a long title, but it's a very popular book. Circulated widely. My library has 3 copies of the early pamphlets. John Locke approved of it, which was nice of him, and it put King into the spotlight during a time of continuing controversy between Anglican high and low church factions. In part, the controversy centered on differing interpretations of the true message of primitive Christianity, or, to quote Hawksmoor's own words from a famous drawing of his of 1712, ye purest times of Christianity. Although politically speaking a staunch Whig, King must generally have applauded the Tory High Church motivated legislation of 1711, which enacted a body of commissioners to build the new churches in and around London at taxpayers' expense to alleviate overcrowding. Hawksmoor became one of the commissioners, 2 surveyors, and got the lion's share of the dozen churches finally built. You can go into all of this in Angela Hornack's book of 2016, After the Fire, and my own book of 2000 about Hawksmoor and theology, London churches. In 1715, a Whig Parliament selected a new body of commissioners. Most of the original Tory members, masterminds of the legislation, along with their architect sympathizers Wren and Vanbrugh, got left out. Hawksmoor, however, continued to carry on the building for the Whig replacement commissioners, among them Sir Peter King, by now Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas. How active a role he played in the commission is hard to say, but in this connection he surely must have heard and even met Hawksmoor. And the architect, for his part, may well have known King through his writings on the primitive church. If nothing else, this connection could offer a hidden ecclesiastical explanation for the preponderance of the 3-part windows in this domestic setting at Ockham. Trinitarian overtones would not have escaped the notice of Peter King. Hence, perhaps, Hawksmoor's persistent wish to include them. Before leaving this present page of the Ockham album, let me consider for a moment a second and much less, here we are, skillful drawing pasted down on blue paper support. And this plan of a rectangular room, there it is, of 37 by 20 feet in size, agrees with the overall dimensions of the eastern or entrance hall at Ockham. The spelling and handwriting of the inscriptions, however, is not Hawksmoor's, and the draftsmanship is poor. Nor is this plan the only such anomalous and anonymous drawing in the album. So I introduce here a note of caution. Not all the things in the album are necessarily from Hawksmoor's hand. In this respect, the intriguing inscription Jacobus T on the verso of that drawing was noted as long ago as 1950 by Whistler, who related it to the presence at Ockham of the painter-architect James Thornhill in 1728-29. More about him in a moment. You've seen these before. Sorry, the equipment is so responsive to the touch that things move forward and back without you knowing it. So there you are. We've seen these already. So here we are. After all the daydreaming about the Serlianas in the sumptuous elevations of 1727, not to forget the upper story plans of 1729, the present drawing of the first floor, datable to the early part of the same year, comes as a surprise, a bit of a contradiction, and also something of a letdown. The H-shaped outline of the original manor house is colored partly gray, and the proposed alterations by Hawksmoor are color-coded yellow for features such as a chimney, the hall itself, the 3-part window that we've seen, the projecting bays, and so on, the very bays that were eventually carried out. Gone, however, are the bow-windowed Serlianas, gone the proposed wings with Gibbs facades, gone the single cube filling out the space on the west, gone the stonework totally encasing the original brick core. It seems that cost considerations must finally have dawned on Lord and Lady King, even if their architect still faintly clung to his visionary designs despite the odds. The second plan on the screen, beside me, showing the entrance and porch on the east, seems slightly later in date, drab in its schematic appearance, and even more dispirited in tone. Hawksmoor's inscription puts it pretty bluntly regarding the wood, brick, and stucco solution, and I quote, "This is the cheapest thing that can be done." Reviewing the album with me in 1984 at the CCA, John Harris acknowledged the importance of the drawing's inscriptions on two other accounts. First, the inscription up here at BB, see it up there, likens the intended effect at Ockham to Thornhill's contemporary design for Moor Park, which, quote, will make the front appear very beautiful and convenient, unquote. Secondly, at CC, down below, further down there, Hawksmoor goes on to state that the wall there, quote, and this is very important, should have been taken down, but now it's too late, I'm afraid, to do it. Obviously, work had started, which displeased the architect. He soldiered on, ever pragmatic if disillusioned. What he hoped to salvage was some of the interior decoration for the entrance hall, to which I now turn, most notably the Serliana he intended as the entrance into the hall from the east. Here, Hawksmoor proposes that the 15-foot wide central Serliana be done with nothing but stone before the wainscot is set up. He artfully draws, as you see, a sculpted bust and a square niche on each side of the two side lights, as well as a sculpted keystone in the center. Pen, ink, and wash impart a liveliness and a feeling of three-dimensionality to these carvings. The dimensions of the Serliana's three openings agree exactly with those that were given in the yellow color-coded portion of the ground plan we just saw. His insistence on stone echoes the wording of his written estimate, which specifies the use of stone. So, and I quote, that what is now to be performed may always remain perfect and entire, as well as beautiful and commendable. This statement sure contrasts with the cheapest solution mentioned just a moment ago on the previous screen. In Mark Antony's words, "Oh, what a fall was there." Two drawings for the entrance hall's interior decoration indicate Hawksmoor's design process in the way that they show his imagination flitting around the room in three dimensions. It's really remarkable. In the one case, he tilts his head up to look at the ceiling, and my golly, I hadn't looked at the ceiling. Just look at the ceiling, folks. That's a Hawksmoor ceiling right above your heads, the one that he shows in the overall drawing. In pen and ink, he partially draws in a molding, not exactly this one, which is bound laurel leaf, on the ceiling, but one that's in the pattern known as the guilloche, tending to cover over the framing devices, which are square, as you see, circular, and rectangular. Okay? The guilloche basically looks like a plaited rope, and in fact, literally, it was to sort of tie the whole composition together, the ensemble of ceiling and walls. Next, in one of the most unique and beautiful drawings within the draftsmanship of the entire period, as Harris and I agreed in 1984, Hawksmoor zooms in on that guilloche, here it is, to produce a combination molding profile with an oblique projection, shows it off to one side. And to do so, he takes 3 scraps of Honig paper from Holland and pastes them together, makes a little kind of a collage of them. The drawing thus shows that process as a concept not only applies to the evolution of the Ockham designs, which we've been seeing going on step by step here in this talk, but also applies to the various pieces of paper themselves and the approaches to them, some paper large, some small, some patched together, some meticulously drafted with a straight edge, some done entirely freehand. The architect's purpose for visualizing such a detailed molding profile, drawn I might add, to full size, was to assist future plasterers by providing them with an accurate set of measurements and curvatures when they set to work on the ceiling. They would have had the benefit of the oblique projection and perspective view to visualize the guilloche's overall appearance. Golos is what Hawksmoor in his obsolete word uses a synonymous for guilloche, derived from the French, connoting a sharp burin engraving, curved grooves into a copper plate, reminding us of Hawksmoor's own, at times, copper plate handwriting, as when he writes with a flourish the excitedly calligraphic G at the end there. I love the machine from this purpose, if nothing else, like that, the wonderful calligraphic G at the end of the word ceiling. Note right above it the conspicuous number 3 in Hawksmoor's hand. This number correlates with the index and the accompanying 3-page long estimate of the several works proposed, dated, just like the drawings, 7 February 1729, now relegated to the back of the album, separate from the cover sheet, which I showed you a little while back. The second and last of the page sides, seen here, concludes with the estimates list of 10 items totaling, down there, £708, 15 shillings. They include new brickwork, not stonework, to encase the east facade, 2 simple Doric, not rich Corinthian columns in the porch, new stone bow windows, the ones that were eventually erected, and specifications related to the interior of the building's entrance hall with its Serliana opening. Recently, an archival photograph of the hall was thoughtfully communicated to me by a fellow of this society, David Taylor, who read about my talk on the society's website, just the sort of feedback you want in this digital age. From the image, I can definitely say that, except for the possibility of the paving being Hawksmoor's proposed decorations were either never executed in the first place or did not survive into the age of photography. At 3 places in this estimate, a Hawksmoor hand, there's one of them down there, refers the reader to a numbered drawing for further confirming the relationship between the written and the drawn documents. I'll return momentarily in my conclusion to the estimate's final remarks, but first consider the description of drawing number 7 in the accompanying index. It reads, in the index over there, number 7, and I quote, "The north front next to the offices, Sir J. Thornhill," and here's the drawing in question. Over there. The inscription on it by Hawksmoor raises intriguing issues. It reads quite plainly, quote, "The front of ye house looking north, where ye back stairs are. This was proposed when Sir James Thornhill was at Ockham." Lacking any other record of the presence of Thornhill at Ockham, we're left to speculate that sometime late in 1728 he visited the house and gave some, perhaps unsolicited, advice related to the present elevation of the 3-story high north facade of Ockham, on the lower level of which are shown 2 tall Corinthian columns carrying a low shed roof to either side. Now, the service wing, as we've seen all along, certainly stood, in fact it still stands, in this northern location. But otherwise, the elevation remains hard to reconcile with Hawksmoor's known plans. As for Sir James Thornhill, born in 1675, died in 1734, we saw that Hawksmoor alluded to Thornhill's portico at Moor Park, Hertfordshire, recently completed in 1728 for Benjamin Stiles. Clearly, both Hawksmoor and his clients knew of this imposing country house. But judging from Hawksmoor's inscription on the present drawing, Thornhill stayed at Ockham only a brief time. And the Hawksmoor estimate, significantly enough, does not cost at all Thornhill's proposal. Looking at Thornhill's all-stone Moor Park in my photograph here of the entrance portico, you can see why. At its grandest, Ockham would never have matched Moor Park. The former, a revamped home for 2 pillars of the establishment. The latter, a new-built mansion for a nouveau riche profiteer, said to have cost £130,000, not 708. Let me conclude my talk today with the what I call beginning and end of my story to Ockham, its alpha and omega, to use an analogy that the theologically minded Peter King would have appreciated. Alpha is represented by Hawksmoor's letter in the album, dated 15 April 1726, very early in the whole process we've been discussing, addressed to the Reverend John Hoadley, Lord King's parson and agent at Ockham. The inscription over on the left reads, "Smoking of the new chimney," presumably written in Hoadley's hand, which makes clear that existing chimneys had already started to malfunction and would need replacing. The spirited freehand sketch by Hawksmoor, the best of its kind in the entire album, illustrates the polygonal clock tower on the service wing at Ockham Park, topped with a lantern supporting a ball. It resembles, on a much smaller scale, the contemporary clock tower he designed over the kitchen court at Blenheim Palace, no less. To either side, he provided alternative design solutions, lettered B and A, to remedy the situation. It's therefore logical to deduce that the architect was involved in the construction, or at least the redesign of the service wing, before becoming engaged on the planned modernization of the existing mansion itself. Whistler reproduced the vibrant sketch I show you here in his 1950 article, which in turn inspired the omega of my analogy, a replica of the clock tower, here it is, erected in the 1960s by property developer Felix Fenston, who bought the remaining buildings at Ockham Park after the fire and worked on restoring them until he died in 1970. I think that Hawksmoor would have regarded stoically the whole ironic episode, the way it's all sort of ended up. I say so because the last, very philosophically inclined, I might say, passage of his estimate at Ockham gives insights into his design ideas and is therefore worth quoting. He writes to Lord King, and I quote, "It is not possible to meddle in the affairs of building, but one runs insensibly into expenses. Therefore, whoever undertakes it must have a good deal of patience as well as money. If we go any other way to treat this old house than what I have proposed in these papers, it will not answer our expectations or be of great service to your lordship. This I am certain of, and would beg your lordship to put some faith in your engineer, that you will strengthen the house, make a handsome front, and 4 beautiful rooms. And I can also assure your lordship that what you do in this manner will not be thrown away, but will remain entire and unalterable. Signed, your lordship's ever faithful servant." All I can say is poor, steadfast Hawksmoor. So Hawksmoor concluded on this relatively low-key note what had begun for the Kings with high hopes. He ended by proposing modest alterations, carried out for the most part with inexpensive materials. He assured Lord King that he would keep a careful watch on the workmen's charges. Altogether, the estimate conveys his tactful and sensitive approach to the problem of how to update an old house on a very limited budget, all the while trying to salvage some, but by no means all, of the original intent. What then accounts for the Ockham Park's enduring fascination? Firstly, how little of its contents ever got off the drawing board, to be honest. But secondly, how much of Hawksmoor's paper trail the Kings preserve for posterity. Secondly, and more importantly perhaps, as Phyllis Lambert realized when she bought the album in the 1960s, to architects like her, it conveys a cautionary tale. Theirs is, in essence, an art of process, of give and take, of compromise, compromise without, however, sacrificing standards, and sometimes, at Ockham, of resignation with dignity. Yet, at its most brilliant, the Ockham Park album in the Canadian Centre for Architecture bears affirming, if poignant, witness to the stuff of which unfulfilled architectural dreams and visions are made. Thank you very much.